Hey everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Crime. Today's episode is the case that really got me into true crime. Even though I was really young at the time, I still remember seeing Natalie's face on Nancy Grace and Greta all the time. So let's get into it. Natalee Holloway disappeared on her senior trip to Aruba on May 30th, 2005. She and about 125 fellow graduates from her high school in Mountain Brook, Alabama, all decided to take this trip to celebrate their final moments as a class before their lives truly began. The most trouble they assumed they would get into was partying too much and having some hangovers. It was supposed to be fun. The drinking age is 18 in Aruba, so most of the graduates were able to let loose and have a drink legally. But that was not the worst. On May 30th, Natalie and her classmates were supposed to fly back at home at 11 a.m. Natalie never showed up for her flight. At first, it was just a joke. Natalie was probably too hungover or slept in, but when it was time to go home, they knew something was wrong.
This is like the most traumatic part for me, for sure, because we thought it was a joke. We were all on the bus. We had to be on the bus, I think, at like 10 o'clock in the morning, 11 o'clock in the morning to leave. And we were, taking roll, and the one person missing was Natalie. So we're joking. We're laughing. We're like, oh my God, where is she? She must be passed out somewhere. She must be asleep and not hearing her alarm. How funny. And then very quickly, it turned into, oh my God, where is she? How come we can't find her? And it quickly turned to hysterics and searching our phones and every single person texting her or trying to get in touch with her.
Someone on the trip called Natalie's mom, Beth, who jumped on a plane right away to find her daughter. David, Natalie's father, wasn't far behind. The last people who saw Natalie were at a club called Carlos and Charlie's. Natalie was seen leaving with 3 men, Joran Vandersloop and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpoe. Most of Natalie's circle knew of Joran. He had been going to Carlos and Charlie's quite frequently throughout their trip, and so had the high school graduates. She was having a good time, and she was drinking heavily. And I want to say this right now because Natalie, her classmates, and their chaperones all get a lot of heat for drinking as much as they did. But listen, probably most of us would have been doing the exact same thing as they were. Personally, I know I would have, and you wouldn't want to have seen me in the days that I graduated from high school. It's a crazy time. You feel like these are the last moments with your friends before you all separate and start anew. Plus, it was legal to drink. Who wouldn't? They were playing Sweet Home Alabama all night long, according to one of the patrons at the club, remembering a bunch of teenagers having the night of their lives. It was rumored that Joran would often frequent this club, as well as the casino at the Holiday Inn Hotel, mostly to meet tourist girls and hook up with them. And it is also rumored that he would roofie these girls. Now again, these are rumors. I wasn't there. I don't know. But it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. One of the girls on the trip, Jessica Kealoha, I think it's how it's pronounced, said that Natalie and Joran were definitely making the moves on each other. There were rumors amongst the graduates that Natalie was into Joran and wanted to hook up with him. When they saw that she was leaving with him and the Kalpoe brothers around 1 a.m. from Carlos and Charlie's, they probably just thought, they were going to hook up before they left the next day, and she'd be back at the hotel. Of course, as we know, Natalie didn't return.
We had been to Carlos and Charlie's, the bar, at least 2 other nights. So it was like, of course we're going to go there one more night. It's our last night. So I remember seeing Joran Vandersloop at the casino at our hotel. That was the first time I saw him, and I remember chatter of him, like he's so cute, who's gonna hook up with him, those types of things were floating around. That was probably the extent to which I got close to him. I definitely remember seeing him. I was playing blackjack. It's the only game I know how to play, but I don't know what he was playing, but he was there. And I don't even remember if Natalie was with him at that point or if any of us were necessarily with him. What I can tell you is he was there multiple nights of our trip. I believe it was the second to last night that I saw him in the casino. He was at Carlos and Charlie's, 1000%. Natalie and I were actually talking at the bar and interacting and having a good time together, for sure. I don't remember what we said. I know that I personally had a few body shots. That definitely happened. We were going to leave, and we decided we were going to wait for the shuttle, and while we were waiting for the shuttle, grab some street food. While we were waiting for street food, I remember seeing Natalie in a white car driving away. The window was rolled down so we could see it was her in the back of the car. My impression was, oh great, she found a ride back to the hotel. That's the last time I believe I saw her.
Beth arrived to Aruba the same night she got the call with her husband, Gregory Twitty, as well as a group of other Alabama parents. She immediately went to Carlos and Charlie's after people on the trip were telling her that was the last place Natalie was seen. The next stop was the Holiday Inn Hotel where Natalie was staying. When she talked to the front desk manager, that was the first time she ever heard the name Joran Vandersloop. They told her that they had seen Natalie and Joran at the casino in the hotel the night before, and they were both caught on surveillance footage talking to each other. On top of that, when Beth saw Natalie's hotel room, she had her bags packed, along with her passport, with her luggage, ready to leave the next morning. That is not a sign that she intended to run away. Natalie also had a scholarship to attend med school at the University of Alabama. She was a good student who had a bright future ahead of her. And I'm not saying that people don't change their minds, or people who don't go to med school or have their lives planned out should automatically be considered as runaways. I'm just saying that it was pretty clear Natalie had intentions to return home. Beth immediately went to the Aruban authorities with this information, and she and 2 other police officers went to Joran's home about 24 hours after Natalie was known to be missing. Joran's father, Paul Vandersloop, spoke with authorities first, while Beth and her crew waited. The thing about Joran's father was that he had power in high places, and he was an up-and-coming judge in Aruba. Not only that, but Joran's godfather and Paul's very good friend, Jan van der Straten, was the police commissioner, or basically what we know as in the United States, the chief. So that plays a big factor into the case. When they were finally able to talk to Joran, at first he said he didn't even know Natalie. But then he changed that to say that he and the Kalpoe brothers drove to a lighthouse to a local beach because Natalie wanted to see the sharks. He also described very in-depth sexual acts that he and Natalie did on the beach to Beth, like literally to her mother. But Paul, Joran's father, was telling the people from Alabama not to be rude, that this is not America, you can't act like that. After this, he claimed they dropped Natalie off at her hotel around 2 a.m. But when she got out of the car, she was stumbling. Joran supposedly offered Natalie help, to which she refused. Then, when she got out of the car, she continued to stumble and she fell and hit her head. That's when Joran claims 2 security guards came up to help her. Deepak corroborated Joran's story. So this is his first story, and his stories change a lot. Tempers began flaring at this point. No one believed a word that came out of Joran's mouth, and they were demanding that he tell them where Natalie is. Joran told Beth he'd take her where he dropped her off at the Holiday Inn, so they all went together. He brought her to the front entrance of the Holiday Inn, claiming that was the last time he ever saw Natalie. The morning after this confrontation, Beth attempts to file a missing persons report, but Aruban police told Beth that Natalie could not be labeled as a missing person yet, to just wait a little while. She'll show back up. She was then told she had to wait 48 hours before a missing persons report could be filed, which just makes me furious because I think we've all seen the show 48 Hours and we all know that's the most crucial time to find someone. But instead, they just avoided that. With no help from authorities, Beth, Dave, and the other parents began their own search parties with the help of local news outlets. Tensions were high between the police and the numerous people flooding in from Mountain Brook, Alabama, to find Natalie. But by day 4 of Natalie's disappearance, police finally looked at the video surveillance from the Holiday Inn at the time Joran claimed he dropped Natalie off. According to Beth, neither he or Natalie appeared. At first, police tried to brush this off by saying Natalie didn't have to enter through the lobby, that she could have went in a side door. But the fact that Joran literally showed Beth and 2 other police officers where he dropped Natalie off at the front door by the lobby tells me everything I need to know. Beth thought so too, and she was sure the police would be able to arrest Joran based on his lies. But they didn't. So she went to the media, which just made things even more tense. This case blew up. If you didn't see this case blasted on your television every single night, I would be shocked.
Natalee Holloway's mother and stepfather made no secret of their growing dissatisfaction with this investigation.
Reached a breaking point.
Deborah Roberts has just arrived in the island's capital.
Terry, tomorrow marks 1 week since 18-year-old.
At first, police arrested Nick John and Abraham Jones, 2 former hotel security guards, on suspicion of murder and kidnapping. Believing Joran's first tale with the help of his godfather, in my opinion, was the reasoning for this. Eventually, they were released. But Beth was adamant Joran had something to do with Natalie's disappearance, and she continued to speak about it publicly, making international news. With the pressure on the police, they finally arrested Joran Vandersloop, Deepak Kalpoe, and Satish Kalpoe on June 9th, 10 days after Natalie disappeared. But this still wasn't good enough. They had 10 full days to talk to Joran's father for legal advice, get their story straight, clean up anything left behind, and lawyer up. Under Aruban law, if there is reasonable suspicion, the prosecutor's office can have a suspect held up for 48 hours. After that, a judge is required to decide whether or not to keep a suspect in jail. After Joran and the Kalpoe brothers are confronted about the surveillance footage that clearly does not show Natalie being dropped off at the Holiday Inn, we get another story. They admitted to lying, saying that the brothers dropped Natalie and Joran off at the beach. Joran claims they were just hanging out, watching the stars, and Natalie was so intoxicated that she started drifting in and out of consciousness. He says Natalie fell asleep and he just left her there at the beach alone and walked home. But the stories continued to change. He then claimed that the brothers picked him up after Natalie was passed out on the beach during a court hearing, but the brothers claimed that was not the case, that they dropped him off and that was it for the night. Joran and the brothers were literally arguing in court as the brothers claim they were not there, but Joran saying that they were there to pick him up. While Joran and the brothers were in jail, Beth didn't stop looking for answers. She went to Paul Vandersloot's home to talk with him along with Greta from Fox News, who covered this case right from the start. Together, they talked with Paul, and Beth and Greta immediately knew something wasn't right here. Greta claims Joran's mother, Anita, also described the graphic sexual details her son and Natalie had that night from what Joran had told her, and it was almost as shocking as when Joran told Beth himself. I mean, I understand that Anita was trying to protect her son, not believing that he could have anything to do with harming another person, but you don't have to bring that up. She already heard it once from your son. She doesn't have to hear it again from his own mother. Then Greta claims Paul was sweating buckets.
But it was way too graphic as for someone who's just sort of sitting there listening to one mother talk to another mother about what her son did to her daughter. And meanwhile, if that couldn't be stranger enough, and it was blunt what she said, Paulus Vandersloop was sitting next to me. I have never in my life seen anyone perspire like Paulus Vandersloop. He was dripping wet. It just kept his flowing. It's like someone put a hose on him. And it was almost distracting because I'd look over and he was soaking wet. Then he would get up. He'd go into the other room. He'd come back with a towel. He'd dry himself off. Meanwhile, here are the two mothers talking and both on the edge of tears and both getting a little revved up. And Mrs. Vandersloot saying that she understood what Beth was going through, but her son had nothing to do with it. Beth saying, I want to know what your son did. I want to know what he did with my daughter. And then getting back in return these sort of graphic descriptions of their interaction. And meanwhile, Paulus is like he's leaving the room every 5 minutes sweating. I've never, ever been able to.
Many people believe this sweat was a sign of guilt, a sign that Paul knew more than he was saying, and maybe knew more than Anita. On June 22nd, Aruban police arrested Paul Vandersloop. He was questioned by the police, and based on this questioning, they had enough suspicion to arrest him. We have no idea what he told the police during this time. However, he was released only 4 days later. There's a lot of people who believe Joran's father had something to do with Natalie's disappearance, a theory that may have been corroborated 12 years later. We'll get to that later on. One witness came forward claiming to see Paul and Joran near a pond around 4 a.m. on May 30th. Apparently, this witness knew Paul and was shocked to see him out so early or late in the night, but there was no evidence that could verify this witness's claim. The two brothers were also released from jail on July 4th after no additional evidence was discovered that linked them or Joran to the crime. Joran was detained for an additional 60 days, I'm assuming because he changed his story, which would be something along the lines of falsifying a police report, or because a judge decided to keep him detained for additional time. The American people were absolutely furious that they just let 3 possible murderers go. But because Joran, the brothers, and Paul were all released, there was no evidence, there was no blood trail or clothing found, and I mean these people searched. Days into the investigation, when it was clear Natalie was not coming back, Aruba and the United States joined forces to start a search and rescue team. They had air equipment looking for disturbed land, infrared sensors to find if Natalie was lost and alive. They had people constantly on the ground looking, especially nearby the beach. But nothing ever came up. But the Aruban people had enough. The island itself is only about 100 square miles, and it was searched up and down with no evidence that pointed to Joran or the Kalpoe brothers. And in a way, I kind of get it. I mean, you have the media from a different country who are telling you that your country sucks, that you're not safe there, and that one of your people is a murderer with no evidence other than he was with Natalie that night. Then Beth held a press conference the day the brothers were released, calling them criminals.
I asked the world to help me. 2 suspects were released yesterday who were involved in a violent crime against my daughter. These criminals are not only allowed to walk freely among the tourists and citizens of Aruba, but there are no limits where they may choose to travel. I am asking all mothers and fathers in all nations to hear my plea. I implore you, do not allow these 2 suspects, the Kalpoe brothers, to enter your country until this case is solved. Do not allow these criminals to walk among your citizens.
For them, Beth took it too far by calling 2 people who were just released from jail criminals. So they rallied together, telling Americans it was time to go home and stop searching.
Calling them criminals when in fact they'd just been released from jail and there were no charges really turned public sentiment against her.
We are here to support the police whose authority has been questioned.
People out there that are putting Arubians down, go home. If you don't like it, go home. You have overstayed your bloody welcome in our island.
This demonstration ordering Beth and anyone searching for Natalie to go home if they don't like their laws completely backfired. In September of 2005, Beth encouraged local government agencies and representatives in Alabama to boycott travel to Aruba and other Dutch territories, claiming they were unsafe for Americans. Many of these Alabama representatives were on board, in addition to Georgia and Arkansas. Tourism, Aruba's main source of income, really took a hit from this, especially after Beth's appearance on the Dr. Phil show, where even he looked straight at the camera, telling Aruba that Americans were going to boycott traveling to Aruba. But this didn't stop the American press demanding that Aruba's law enforcement find Natalie. Now, a lot of people claim that the investigation was an entire police cover-up for Joran Vandersloop to prove to the American people that they were not murderers and to keep the tourism alive. But I honestly don't believe this. I think most of the police were doing their jobs, although dragging their feet at times, so they could look competent and say that they solved this crime. Police kept looking despite the bad press coverage, spending millions of dollars to find Natalie. There were so many tips that were brought in, but as we all know, none of them led anywhere. Every time a local saw a white blonde woman, it seemed like a tip was called in hopes that they would find Natalie. In July of 2005, a gardener called in a tip claiming they saw Joran at a small pond near a racket club on May 30th between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. They also claimed that Joran came out of the pond covered in mud with a missing shoe. By late July, the pond was drained in search of Natalie or even the missing shoe, but nothing was found. Another tip came from a local jogger claiming they saw someone burying a blonde-haired woman at a landfill on the morning of May 30th. So the police searched that multiple times with cadaver dogs, and nothing came from that either. The Kalpoe brothers and Joran Vandersloop were arrested again on November 21st, 2007 in regards to suspicion of involvement in manslaughter and causing serious bodily harm that resulted in the death of Natalee Holloway. I believe this arrest was in regards to a crab trap in the ocean where possible fabric belonging to Natalie's blouse may have been found. But after DNA testing that did not result back to Natalie, the three were let go once again. A month later, Aruba's prosecutor decided to close the case. But only 2 months after this, there was a reason to reopen the case. Dutch reporter Peter de Vries claimed he'd cracked the case wide open with a taped confession from Joran. He befriended Joran at a casino in Holland in 2007, speaking to him for only 2 months straight, gaining his trust day by day. Eventually, he'd mic'd and hid cameras within his vehicle and recorded a conversation about Joran's involvement in Natalie's disappearance. In this taped confession, which is spoken in Dutch, but you can still find English translations on YouTube, Joran admits that he knows what happened to Natalie. He told Peter that they were having relations, and all of a sudden, she started seizing up. He said he tried to shake her, but she wasn't waking up, so he called a friend, who Peter later found out was Joran's childhood friend named Dory. According to this conversation, Dory told Joran that his boat was right by the pier nearby and that he'd help him out. They both took her to the boat, but Dory was the one who took her out to sea, only 2 miles away, and threw her into the ocean. Afterwards, Joran admits to texting his girlfriend, "Hey honey, I'll see you tomorrow," because he had to act like nothing was happening. And then he said he didn't even feel bad. He even called the Kalpoe brothers stupid for going along with this story about dropping Natalie off at the hotel, that he was that smart. After Peter released this to the press and law enforcement, Joran got right on it, claiming he only told Peter what he wanted to hear. Joran's lawyer also claims this was not a confession and that Joran denies any involvement in Natalie's disappearance. Peter even interviewed Joran after the confession was released, and Joran continued to claim it was not a confession. Peter claims Joran kept his composure the entire interview, until the interview was over, when Joran splashed wine all over Peter. Either way, the taped confession led nowhere, with law enforcement claiming this confession didn't match up with their evidence. Joran was also smoking marijuana during this recording, so I also wonder if that led to the prosecutor ultimately deciding to throw this out as evidence. In all honesty, a defense attorney could easily sway a judge or a jury to believe that he was under the influence, and then he would just be let out again. But the confession did give a slight feeling of peace for the Holloways, finally knowing what happened to their daughter. Beth still questions why Joran didn't just call an ambulance, but later she started to put the pieces together. Friends of Natalie told Beth that Joran gave Natalie a drink that night. Beth assumes that Joran spiked her drink with GHB, a date rape drug that, according to Wikipedia, has been shown to reduce the elimination rate of alcohol. This may explain the respiratory arrest that has been reported after indigestion of both drugs. For Beth, this was why Joran felt he could not call the police, that they would find the drugs in Natalie's system and he would be found responsible for her death. But just months after this taped confession, the story changes again. On November 24th, 2008, Joran agreed to do an interview with Greta when he claimed that he sold Natalie into sex trafficking. He even later wrote a book talking about this, but he claimed he wasn't going to release it until he could get as much money as he could. So this is when I get mad, like so mad. I think extremely bad thoughts about this disgusting piece of filth, because that's exactly what Joran Vandersloop is. Joran was not done exploiting people for money, not even close, and he went straight to the source, Beth. In March of 2010, he contacted her lawyer claiming he would finally give the location of Natalie's remains for $250,000. Doing anything to bring her daughter home, Beth complied and wired $25,000 to Joran with the FBI's assistance in exchange of a video recording of Joran giving an address to a house in Aruba. By the time police figured out the entire story was a lie, that the house was not even built at the time, Joran was off with his money. Alabama authorities had an arrest warrant for Joran for extortion and wire fraud, but he was nowhere to be found. Let's just take a minute here and say how absolutely mind-blowing this sicko was. To torture a mother, bribe her with money, and still not bring closure. While the Holloways were devastated once again, Joran spent 3 weeks in Peru, partying it up until May 30th, 2010, 5 years to the day of Natalie's disappearance, when another tragedy struck. 21-year-old Stephany Flores Ramirez was reported missing in Lima, Peru. She was attending a Texas Hold'em gambling tournament and she was doing quite well. She told her father she was going to finish up the tournament and be home soon. She never returned home, which was so unlike Stephany, so her father reported her missing right away. Police went to the hotel that Stephany was staying at and started going through surveillance footage. She was seen around 3 a.m. next to a blonde man who she left with around 5 a.m. to go back to his hotel room. That man was Joran Vandersloop. Joran changed his hair color, most likely in an attempt to evade his inevitable arrest for extortion. No one could have ever imagined what he'd really be arrested with. 3 hours after Stephany and Joran went back to his hotel room, Joran left, telling the staff not to disturb the girl in his hotel room. 3 days later, her body was found, half-dressed, brutally beaten, with a broken neck. It was ruled that she died from blunt force trauma to the head, causing hemorrhaging in her brain. She died from a brutal attack. Police found that the hotel room was registered to Joran, and they needed to find him quick. When he was finally captured on June 4th in Chile with a laptop, bloody clothes, and detailed charts of ocean currents around Lima, Peru. Interesting. He was extradited to Peru. He was seen wearing a bulletproof vest in front of hundreds of cameras. That just goes to show you how hated this man really is. At first, he claimed random attackers came in and killed Stephany until he was interrogated. During the investigation, they found that Stephany was under the influence of amphetamines, but they did not know if she took them willingly or not. Amphetamines are also not some kind of date rape drug. If anything, they would make the average person quicker and more alert. Things like meth, MDMA, Adderall are also amphetamines. They also found that the laptop in Joran's possession contained Google searches like relationship with Peruvian and Chilean police and countries that do not extradite in Latin America. On June 7th, Joran confessed to killing Stephany. He claimed that he left the hotel room to go get some coffee, and when he returned, he found Stephany on his laptop without his permission. It is alleged that she was playing an online poker game and saw a hate message sent to Joran about Natalie. That's when she put 2 and 2 together and confronted him. After this, he attacked her and she attempted to escape the room, but he got to her first. In his confession, he writes, "I did not want to do it. The girl intruded into my private life. She had no right. I went to her and I hit her." She was scared, we argued, and she tried to escape. I grabbed her by the neck and hit her. Later, Joran attempted to retract his statement, but it was too late. Peru officials charged Joran with first-degree murder and robbery, and he pled guilty. He received only 28 years because Peruvian laws do not allow life sentences unless the murder was under extreme circumstances. He was sent to Miguel Castro prison in Peru, but it seemed a little too easy for him, in my opinion. Apparently, he's allowed conjugal visits because his wife became pregnant in 2014. So, yeah, that's great. He was also allowed to be interviewed in prison with his wife sitting right next to him as he talks about his book, insinuating that he sold Natalie into sex trafficking. He also basically called the Aruban police idiots, that he never told the truth because the cops, quote, "they didn't ask me the right questions," unquote. Once again, with his wife sitting right next to him. He was later transferred to another prison where he was allegedly stabbed by fellow prisoners. Dave Holloway has also stated that when he is released from prison in Peru, he will be extradited to the United States for the extortion charges, where he could face up to 50 years. Joran Vandersloop may never see the light of day again. Either way, the public is outraged, mostly at Aruba once again. People feel Aruba is ultimately responsible for Stephany's death. Joran should have never been able to roam free for 5 years and have the ability to get his hands anywhere near Stephany. She should still be here today. Even Joran's own mother, who previously defended her son, has spoken out. She claims he is psychologically disturbed, saying, quote, "Joran is sick in the head, but he didn't want any help," unquote. Now, with his conviction of murdering Stephany and his very possible involvement in killing Natalie, she thinks it's time to let Joran go. But she also defends her son still, saying that the persecution in the eyes of the public and the law traumatized Joran, so much so that she wishes she sent him to get mental help after Natalie's disappearance. Apparently, it got even worse after Peter DeFries released the confession video, saying it hurt Joran because he thought they were friends. Sorry, Mrs. Vandersloop, how does that even make it even remotely okay that he brutally beat and killed someone? How? And I want to go back to the Aruban police again because this is the part where I stopped defending them. I counted all the confessions that we know of so far that Joran has spoken on. And so far, I've come up with 7. But definitely reach out if you have any more. So let's go over them. 1. He didn't know Natalie at all. 2. Joran and the brothers dropped Natalie off at the Holiday Inn hotel. 3. He left her passed out on the beach and walked home. 4. He left her passed out on the beach and got a ride home. 5. He claimed that the brothers took her home from the beach and he walked after realizing he was way more looked into than they were. 6. The recorded confession that Natalie was having seizures and a friend dumped her body in the ocean. And 7, sex trafficking and he sold her to a pimp. How many more confessions do you need? Once again, this manipulative, disgusting, extorting creature should have never stepped outside of a jail cell, and he never should again. Ultimately, the death of Stephany solidified the majority of the public's mind that Joran Vandersloop was guilty of killing Natalie as well. The brutality of the attack and the fact that he had charts of nearby ocean currents told the entire story for myself and many others. But the story doesn't end here. Despite the hurt and trauma that has come along with losing a daughter, getting one step closer and 100 steps back, the Holloways have never given up on finding Natalie's remains. Although she was legally presumed dead in 2012, they won't stop until she's brought home. In the now controversial Oxygen special, which aren't they all, called The Disappearance of Natalee Holloway, Dave Holloway continues the journey to find his daughter's remains, receiving the most credible tip he'd seen in 12 years in 2017. But the reasons why this docuseries was so controversial was because A, they immediately said that the remains had been found in Aruba, but that we wouldn't know if they belonged to Natalie until the end. And B, Beth had nothing to do with the documentary. From what I've heard, she found out, along with everyone else, that remains were found. And when she reached out to Oxygen to ask if they were her daughters, she was basically told that she would have to watch the documentary like everyone else. That's her daughter. That's disgusting. So, yeah, good on you, Oxygen. Good on you. And listen, I love those documentaries as much as anyone else, and I think that they do a great job at getting the word out there. But I've definitely come to notice just how shady they are towards victims' families. Ultimately, throughout this documentary, Dave and his hired private investigator meet up with an informant who knows a friend of Joran's named John Ludwig, and he spills the beans. He claims that Joran admitted to John that Natalie and him were at the beach and she suddenly started foaming at the mouth. He says Joran called his father to help him, and his father did, burying Natalie in the Aruban National Forest. But in 2010, when Joran moved back to Aruba, he asked his friend John Ludwig to help him move Natalie's body out of a national forest where she was buried. He thought that the police would eventually find it, so he offered John $1,500 to help him move her body, and he claims he did. He claims they dug it up, cremated her, and spread her ashes in the ocean. But here's the thing that automatically made me think this guy's a crock of you-know-what, was the cremation part. And here's why. In 2013, 10-year-old Amani Moss was dying of neglect by her stepmother and father. After she died, they attempted to cremate Amani, but the father claimed nothing was happening to her. And that's because it needs to be about 1,500 degrees to cremate a body. Even with severely decomposed remains, human teeth can take days to burn at this consistent temperature of 1,500 degrees. It's not just going to take an average bonfire. John changed his story multiple times throughout the documentary. At first, he claimed the remains were originally buried in the national forest. Then he said they were nearby his aunt's house, which was this secluded desert land, brought her remains to a cave nearby to burn the skull to get rid of her hair, hammered her bones to dust, and then he brought the rest back to his aunt's house. But then he said that he hired a fisherman to dump Natalie's remains in the ocean. Another former friend of John's, who he also spoke about Natalie to, told Dr. Phil that Joran would tell John to never tell the truth, basically telling him to do exactly what he did because it worked. I mean, Joran changed his story so many times, police could never determine which story was the truth, which was how he was always able to get away with it. So it appeared John did the same. When it appeared that John was nothing but a liar, the documentary took a complete turn. John and his friend Gabriel returned to Aruba at John's aunt's home, where he claims he kept small pieces of bones in the backyard as a trophy, and bones were actually found. When the bones were tested, Aruban police told Dave that they were only animal bones, but when Dave took these bones to a private lab in Washington, D.C., a forensic pathologist was able to confirm that these bones were human remains. So that just created even further distrust for Aruban authorities. It seemed like finally we had some answers, especially when a forensic pathologist claimed the bones belonged to a woman and decomposition levels matched the time frame of Natalie's disappearance. But sadly, the remains were found not to belong to Natalie. I do hope that whoever those remains belong to, another family has received closure for their loved one. But take a second and think. It's pretty weird that these human bones were found in John's aunt's backyard. So either John did something we don't know about, which I fully believe, or one of his family members did. Now, this John Ludwig guy is just a piece of crap. Just not a good person at all. So here's a clip of him on Nancy Grace talking about the death of Stephany Flores.
With us, joining us, guest John Ludwig, friend of Joran Vandersloop. You're a friend of Joran Vandersloop. Are you surprised that he's actually pled guilty to murder?
Well, he really didn't have a choice in this situation, so I'm just hoping for the best. I mean, even I can't dispute the evidence. He obviously murdered her. I'm not saying that it wasn't provoked, and I believe he did have post-traumatic stress syndrome. But
what do you mean provoked? You think Stephany Tatiana provoked Joran Vandersloop into murdering her? What do you mean by that?
I do believe so. If she got the email and figured out he was involved in Natalie stuff, she should have just immediately left the room and not confronted him.
What? How did that provoke him?
It enraged him, obviously. So she shouldn't have done that. I don't.
She shouldn't have done that. Okay, John Ludwig. No offense, but do you realize how crazy you sound right now?
I'm not saying she deserved it, but she definitely could have prevented it by just leaving immediately. And if you're in a room with someone,
what?
If you're in a room with someone you believe might have been involved in a murder, you don't stay there and talk to them about it. You immediately leave the area. Yeah, we're just hoping for the best. Hopefully he gets out in 10 years or less.
Oh, and it gets worse. Here's a clip of him reacting to this interview years later.
Exact. I just fucking said it. She finds out he's involved by some goddamn email she claims and fucking stays there and slaps him around. How dare she put her hands on him to make him even take it to that level? There's no excuse. There's no fucking excuse, and don't try to make one for her. Yeah, I sound crazy. Because you're dumb enough to find out someone was involved in a murder and stay in the room to slap him around? And I'm crazy. Yeah, psychological trauma inflicted upon my guy. Because these dumb bitches. Yeah. A murder's clearly a reaction. Yeah. Why it wouldn't have happened if she didn't react by slapping him around and calling him a murderer.
She also sustained a fracture to one of her cervical vertebrae in a young, healthy woman.
Yeah, and that damn fracture probably caused a bruise on my fucking guy's hand. How rude of her. Dude, this bitch should oh, man. She should rot in her grave over what she did to my guy, putting him in jail for all these years. I should piss on her fucking grave for that shit.
Which one? There's two of them. Which one?
Which one?
Then, on top of that, John Ludwig attempted to kidnap a Florida woman, Emily Highstand, and she ended up killing him in March of 2018. I say good for her. She told Dr. Phil that she and John never dated, as it's often reported, but John was really into her and trying to destroy the relationship she was in at the time. She thought he was harmless at first, but then he started talking about Natalie and the things he'd done to her remains. After this, she blocked him from ever contacting her again, but John always found a way. He'd make phone numbers on those texting apps and would text Emily saying he forgave her, which in his own delusional mind, he felt she had wronged him by not wanting to be his girlfriend. One day, he went to her house as Emily was just returning home. In her driveway, he attacked her with a knife and the fight ensued in her car. He shoved a knife towards her throat and told her to do everything he said. As he realizes the keys aren't in the ignition and he can't just get away, he demands Emily to give him the keys or else he'd kill her. Pretending to grab her keys, instead, she grabbed the knife that was at her throat and ran out of the car. As John continued to follow her with threats, she felt it was her or John, so she stabbed him and ran, not even knowing that she struck him. He was eventually pronounced dead at the hospital, so at least we don't have to listen to any more of his lies, but I still am curious as to whose bones were in that backyard. So let's talk theories, because Natalie's case still remains unsolved. I think it's pretty obvious Joran Vandersloop had something to do with Natalie's disappearance. Personally, I do think he is mentally unstable, as his mother described, and that's why he's changed his story so many times. I think it's a game to him. I mean, if you're going to call a missing person's mother, who fully believed that you did something to her daughter, just to mess with her, you are sick. However, let's go back to the first story Joran told, because I think that's the closest story to the truth. That and the recorded confession. The sharks. When he said Natalie wanted to go see the sharks, I truly believe he dumped her in the water that day. This guy had connections in Aruba. He could have easily found someone with a boat. I also think that Natalie was drugged. According to John Ludwig, who is not a credible witness by any means, but he did know Joran, who we know likes to talk about what happened. Joran told John, supposedly, that Natalie was foaming at the mouth, and he told Peter that she was seizing. He also told John that he ordered 2 drinks at the bar and asked the bartender to make it good, implying to spike it. There are many combinations of drugs that are mixed with alcohol that could very likely kill someone. I also believe this happened. I think Joran was stupid and slimy, but I don't think he physically murdered Natalie in the way he murdered Stephany Flores. I don't buy his PTSD defense claim as to why he killed Stephany. I think he knew he got away with whatever he did to Natalie, and he felt he could do it again. I do think Natalie was drugged, and he was scared that it would come back to him. John also stated that's why he didn't call police or medical attention, because Natalie was so messed up that Joran thought he would be charged with rape, so he had to get rid of her. I cannot definitively theorize if Joran had help, and if he did, who helped. His father is no longer alive, so we will never know for sure. I think Joran acted on his own, but his father and the Kalpoe brothers knew or suspected more. But if you have another theory, definitely leave a comment on YouTube or the Facebook page. But what's the lesson in all of this? Because there definitely is one. No matter what, no matter how hard we try, no matter how we are able to learn about and analyze killers, there will always be people in the world who want to harm others. Whether or not you are traveling or in your backyard, do not go somewhere with a stranger alone, especially without telling someone where you are or where you're going. And I know we should be able to trust people not to throw our bodies overboard or attack us in a hotel room, but we clearly can't. If you do make the decision to go somewhere with someone you don't know, tell someone. Tell someone who you're with, tell them what time you'll be back, tell someone where you're going. And if those plans change, tell someone. And never, ever take a drink from someone, even if you feel like you know them well. And if you leave a drink somewhere and it's opened, don't drink it. It's not worth it. There are also apps for this, like Be Safe, and that's the letter B, then safe, that tracks your location and has an SOS button that automatically alerts authorities. This is totally not sponsored, and I'm sure there are many other apps that have similar features, but there are ways now to better protect ourselves. Take care of yourself, your friends, and your family. Beth and Dave have waited over 15 years, completely unable to finally bring their daughter home, like they should have on May 30th, 2005. Take the extra precautions to make sure this doesn't happen to you or your family. Thank you so much for listening to Let's Talk Crime, and I'll see you next time.